Welcome to the Faith and Trauma Center podcast, a unique approach to exploring the intersections of religion, trauma, sacred spaces, and mental health.
Each month, we choose a different topic to discuss weekly from different perspectives. The first week, we explore the faith, community, and clergy perspective. The second week, the mental health practitioner perspective. The third week, the perspective of individuals working to heal from religious trauma. And the fourth week, we invite a special guest who has been impacted by our monthly topic to join us.
This format follows the design of the Faith and Trauma Center's 3 pathways for resources and education. We invite you to explore all the additional material that we offer at faithandtraumacenter.org.
Let's jump into this week's conversation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Faith and Trauma podcast. I am Holly Madden. I'm one of the co-hosts. I'm here with my good friend and fellow co-host, Christy Love. And we have, we're going to try to make this a little bit shorter today because we've got a timeline to keep. So maybe this podcast will kind of be wrapped up a little bit briefer. I know we can both get to talking, but we love that. And
Us? No.
We love that you listen and join in on our crazy conversation. So before we get started, I feel like we always get to start with something fun. I'm going to ask you a question, but you kind of threw me on as like hosting. So I'm like trying to wrap my brain around a question. What is something that has brought you joy this week?
Okay, well, mine's easy this week because for those of you that have been listening to podcasts for a while, you know I am like the organized, goal-oriented spreadsheet nerd of the duo here. And so, yeah, first part of January, man, this is my sweet spot. So this is like new goals, new systems, new habit trackers, all the things that bring me a lot of joy to be able to kind of reset and work towards some new pieces for this new year. I'm super excited about 2026 in general. I'm excited personally. I'm super excited for the church that I lead. I'm also just like really, really stoked for Faith and Trauma Center. And we've got a lot of exciting things coming up this year and some great podcast topics and webinar topics and content development that'll be rolling out on the website. So I just feel like it's going to be a good year. So that brings me a lot of joy.
I love that. And I love that about you. I was actually like in a texting conversation with both of my sisters and they've both set some like goals. And I was like, I've had the like reverse of I've been like trying to connect more with like seasonal living and like winter being a time of more rest and like incubation. So I set some goals, but my goals have been set in like a more gentle way, I think. And I'm going to revisit that closer to spring as like, okay, now it's time to like actually do things like what feels really right to be doing more of. So it's more of like, I feel like I set like a dream list for myself. So as I was talking with both my sisters who were like hardcore, like sugar fasting and like not spending anything this month and like all these things, like have a goal of list, I was like, I am not goal setting and I am happy about it. So
You and I have always approached this very differently.
Very different.
So, and we appreciate that about each other.
I love that. Something that has brought me joy this week, besides that, and a whole lot of beautiful, wonderful birds in my life that have just been like speaking to me. And this beautiful little bird mug that I'm drinking my hot tea out of. But we had kind of a rough week last week just because my husband had surgery, and so we had like I was in caregiver mode and just the emotions and the roller coaster of that and trying to make that week really meaningful for my kiddos who are both very, well, one of them especially was very empathetic and worried about her dad, and the other one who has very spectrum vibes of like he's fine, he's there, he's fine. So it was a busy week, kind of a tiring week, but we've gone back to school and gone back to work. And something that has brought me joy has been getting to do I one of the skill sets that I have in a classroom setting is falls under like the art category. And so I have like made this commitment to do art with my kiddos every single day. And the teacher that I work with has like given that to me, which has been really sweet and really kind. And so getting to do some really fun art projects and seeing like breakthroughs in kiddos that because I work in a classroom with very low functioning autism or kiddos with developmental delays, like getting to see them like enjoy art more and more. And so after break, getting to be in that. So from like a person of like creativity, and I know this kind of probably t ties into what we're going to talk about. Like it's fun to see that gift manifesting in this like current very short-lived job that I've been in for the last year. So
Mm,
but yeah,
I love that.
it's been lovely. So, um, we have a really cool conversation. I feel like I kind of teased it last week because I kind of brought it to the surface a little bit in our conversation on wintering. And we've been processing this now for a couple of weeks, and you were the one that was kind of like, this foot would fall, like this would be a perfect conversation for after the new year. So, do you want to introduce that topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that we set out to do with Faith and Trauma Center was to really try to resource this intersection of faith and mental health and advocacy and trauma work and healing. And so, a lot of times, what we get to do, which is kind of fun, is we get to look at different tools, different pieces, different theories or frameworks that maybe have kind of been created for one specific thing, and kind of try to test the boundaries of that a little bit, right? And kind of expand it and tease it out just a little bit to say like, wow, that's a really great concept and I resonate with that. But how does that also apply here? What would that look like? And what does that maybe look like to use that as a baseline for a conversation about a different kind of model? And so Holly and I both really enjoy kind of doing some of those things and looking at things together. We also enjoy creating new things together as we kind of look at different cycles and different pieces like that. So, all that to say, recently I was having a conversation here in my community. I was having coffee with someone who has been doing trauma-informed training work in the healthcare industry for well over a decade. And we had been connected by someone who knew that we both were engaged in the trauma world and trauma work, and thought we would really get along and have a lot to talk about. And they were right. We had a great coffee. One of the things that came up at that coffee was the concept of the window of tolerance, which is for many of you who are listening, who are in the mental health world, probably a concept that you're incredibly familiar with, right? And so this concept being that the window of tolerance is really kind of the area in which we are comfortable and we can tolerate without becoming hyper aroused and kind of like really ramped up and can't calm down, or without becoming hypo aroused, where we really kind of start to shut down and we kind of start to go into freeze mode a little bit, or we get really numb or really lethargic or depressed in that space. And so your window of tolerance is kind of what we would call like your optimal state, right? And for each of us, our window of tolerance is unique and different to each of us. And so that's kind of where the conversation, Holly, began, right? Was we were talking about this concept, and I was talking about from a religious trauma perspective, what that looks like to apply that model into people that we're working with, like in my religious trauma support group that I lead, who may be like just setting foot inside of a building is really going to challenge their window of tolerance, right? Setting foot inside of a church building, or entering into a sanctuary specifically, or hearing worship music is really going to challenge their window of tolerance. And so, like, trying to start to recognize what are some of the frames of that window, right? Like, what are some of those triggers? What are some of those pieces where right now I know this is where I'm going to shut down, or this is where I'm going to get really, amped up and have a hard time calming down and getting activated. And what does that look like for us to define those for ourselves? So I'll kind of stop there for right now and like bring you in with some thoughts. But that kind of lays the foundation a little bit for where this conversation came from, where it starts.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've talked a little bit about in other podcasts, and it just makes me think of this how one of the biggest, most important work that we can ever do as an individual is work on our own capacity for emotional regulation and like understanding how we regulate, understand how we are when we're dysregulated, understand the relationship that we have with emotions, especially when vulnerability has been something that has been really scary for us or suppressed for us, and some of those different pieces. And that this is where this becomes so important when you talk about like the window of tolerance is like being able to like have confidence and understand this is where I am. And I think that it's important. You said everybody's window of tolerance is unique. As someone who is an incredibly sensitive person, I have compared that to so many people, and I have felt like I was doing so much less, or I was ex like I should have been able to handle situations better because I felt like I wasn't meeting that level of other people. And my own work has helped me realize, like, as an empath, as someone who's incredibly sensitive, as someone who has some like sensory processing stuff, like my window of tolerance is a lot smaller than other people's maybe, and my it's going to be bigger than other people as well. And that's really important for me to be able to grasp and to respect about myself. And so I've experienced a lot of confidence in that. And so I speak that to someone who's maybe feels a little bit like, oh, we're talking about this. Like I feel nervous talking about this because my window of tolerance is really small. I also think it's important to talk about, and as you're talking about religious trauma, that window of tolerance for ourselves can be different in different seasons as well.
Mhm.
And especially if you've been in a season where you've experienced a crisis or you've experienced trauma from an event, that window of tolerance gets smaller for a season. And the hope is that through healing and through work and through exposure, like that increases over time. And
Yeah.
there may be pieces that don't. But especially if you are a caregiver or you're a pastor or a clergy member or you work in mental health care and you are exposed to a lot of suffering day in and day out, that experience of burnout is so incredibly common. And that can be one of the biggest triggers for that window being smaller. And that's actually a really beautiful protective thing. Like our nervous system, the fight or flight response is a protective measure our body takes. And it's really important that we embrace that and we find ways to work with that. And so that's just like to speak out some affirming or encouraging um, language to people who may feel a little bit even triggered by this response. Because I know if we're in a season where our window of tolerance seems a lot smaller and we may feel some regret or guilt or whatever for that, like that's actually a really powerful thing to be able to acknowledge and to be in that space and be present with it and realize our body's oftentimes trying to protect us. And that's a good thing, and we can work in that space. So,
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that's also really important is when we talk about, especially in terms of like a healing modality, right? Like when we use the window of tolerance in someone's healing journey, a lot of times the goal therapeutically is to expand that window of tolerance, right? And learn how to cope with those edges. I like to call them our growing edges. Everybody's kind of got a different term for that. But like, okay, I feel myself getting activated. How can I ground and stay engaged in that space, right? Like, how can I challenge myself to expand that window a little bit? Vice versa, right? Like, oh, I feel myself getting numb or shutting down or disengaging from this. How do I challenge myself to stay grounded, stay engaged, and kind of push that window out a little bit? And I say that because I think one of the things that's really important for us to name, Holly, is, when we talk about like the six sources of religious trauma, we talk about that being in faith communities, also in like faith-filled households, workplaces, schools. But another really big one, and one that I think is just overwhelming for most people right now, and that is just Christian culture, like culture in general, right? We are living in a time and a season where whether you are a follower of the teachings of Jesus or not, it's really hard to escape the impact of Christian culture and how much it has just seeped into our headlines every day, our political landscape, into our economics, into everything when you've got this huge infusion and push of Christian nationalism. And so I think, and this is kind of where I wanted to bring this conversation is like, so we have this concept of the window of tolerance that traditionally we talk about in terms of like trying to deal with triggers or anxiety and trying to increase. I would almost challenge us that when we're talking about specifically like the world today and it feeling overwhelming and it's just so big and so much, right? Like I think you and I both have these conversations with people regularly, and I hear people all the time say, I'm just so overwhelmed. Like
Mhm.
I can't engage with it. I have to turn the news off. I have to turn social media off. It's all just too much. It's too bad. Like it's just all encompassing. I
Mhm.
almost think that the like making an inverse of the window of tolerance and kind of instead of expanding out, giving ourselves some permission in some instances
Mhm.
to reduce our lens. And so
Mhm.
here's what I mean. Like when we talk about, especially like how do we navigate a world that's just seeped in religious trauma triggers right now for a lot of people, um, you're not needing to expand that window anymore because it is already everywhere and overwhelming. But I think instead, what does it look like to give yourself permission to resize your frame and to try to find a starting point, right?
Mhm.
Like, I think I am hearing a trend with a lot of people who had maybe begun a deconstruction journey before or had begun some religious trauma healing work before. And a lot of them kind of feel like, man, this is just like frozen. I can't, I can't do that work right now because I'm just constantly angry. I'm
Mhm.
constantly frustrated and furious and all the emotions. And so I think one way that we try to push past that kind of feeling of frozen and stuck
Mhm.
is it is big. And let's acknowledge that it's big and huge and hard and triggering and overwhelming and all the other adjectives that we could throw at it.
Mhm.
But what does it look like to say, I'm intentionally going to shrink down? And like, here is my lens of engagement,
Mhm.
right? Like, my window of tolerance is overwhelmed.
Mhm.
Instead of pushing out, I need to give myself permission to push in. And I think for some of us, we need to hear that language and give
Mhm.
ourselves permission to recognize that a lot of times healing work, Holly, right? Like uses language of growth and expansion. And sometimes we don't always think of like intentionally focusing or intentionally making space smaller for a season as part of that healing journey as well. But I think it's important because it gives us this ability to say, I can't deal with all of this, but this is what I can deal with. This is the place that I can handle. I can do this book club, or I can have coffee with a friend regularly and have this conversation, or I can join a support group and on these days be willing to engage in this conversation, or, like whatever that piece is for you.
Yeah.
And it's kind of recognizing this is what I can tolerate right now.
Mhm.
And then we begin to kind of apply that same concept, right? Like slowly. And as things shift around you, we start to push those boundaries again.
Yeah. And I think this is where our own self-awareness is so incredibly critical of just knowing maybe who we are, especially emotionally, knowing kind of that level of sensitivity that we have, knowing where we're at in our own journey, if we are experiencing a lot of burnout or if we're in a season of like a lot of needing a lot of healing and a lot of grounding work, and being able to name those things to kind of give ourselves permission
Yeah.
to narrow that lens. And I speak from that from experience because there's been a lot of years that, we expanded, like our lens was our community. And there was a lot of work that we did and really on this like big community level. And in me needing to take some steps back for myself, like that lens had to get a lot smaller
Yeah.
for me to do the work that I needed to do on myself and to do a lot of the like soul searching of what was next for me. And I struggled with, I wrestled with some guilt for that. And then found that there was so much when I like made that lens really small that I could be doing, that I could be giving inside
Yeah.
of my gifts and my passion on a way that was just, it felt really beautiful. It felt really powerful. And
Yeah.
I've been really grateful for that perspective because for me, that has been really empowering of like, this is not a piece of me that's gone. It's just a piece of me that needed to like focus a little bit more
Yeah.
intentionally on this more specific area or this more specific person or group of people, and just pour my compassion in that way because I needed a little bit more time to fill back up. And I think that that can be a really beautiful space when we're willing to acknowledge that because we have so much to give. And I struggle with because I've done it too, like feeling like, oh, I'm not doing enough, I'm not good enough. But
Yeah.
even the pouring into one person, like you said, coffee with one person, like that can make such a difference. I know I've quoted this before. It's just it was such a life-changing book. But I recently read Everything is a Story by Caitlin B. Curtis. I have always loved everything that she has written and her voice is just incredibly powerful. But she has a chapter where she talks about in that book, and I think I may have mentioned this before, like sitting on an airplane and like someone to her left is watching this movie and someone to her right is scrolling like news because now you have internet on airplanes and someone in front of her is watching a different movie and she just like closes her eyes because she's like, I'm surrounded by too many stories. Like I just need to be with
Mhm.
myself and my own story. And then she goes on to talk about how like we are overexposed to stories. We're overexposed to suffering, to need. We're never supposed to. And she says something I'm paraphrasing here, but it's like we were never supposed to have hold this many stories at once. And the result of that is often overwhelm. And I can relate to that. Like I read the news about like climate change and the suffering and in so many other countries and in other communities and in my own community. And then I just like, you just like stop scrolling or you turn off the news and you just like sit in
Yeah.
overwhelm. Like, what am I supposed to do about that? And I think that it keeps a lot of us from doing because it is incredibly overwhelming when ours to do is maybe this small or this small and to make that more to give ourselves permission to see that as good enough is where we need to make that shift in our perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you talk about, where Caitlin Curtis talks about that we're overwhelmed by stories, right? I think, again, because we're so familiar with that model and that idea of the window of tolerance, I also think there are other things you could substitute in that imagery, right? Like, yes, window of tolerance if you're trying to expand your triggers, your anxiety, your OCD triggers, whatever those things are. Um, But there's also like a window of compassion and empathy for us, right? Like I can invest only this much and then at that point like it's counterproductive to everyone. But like how do I know my window of compassion, my window of empathy, my window of generosity, right? Like you've got all these things, concepts that you could fit into that model. And recognizing like it may not be a lot right now, but what I can do, like I can do well. And then
Mhm.
as I am healing, as I am growing, as I am, whatever that looks like, as I'm getting more energy or more resources, I can start to expand that
Mhm.
in a way that allows my impact to grow over time. But I think there's this assumption for so many people that our healing journey should go from like nothing to everything all at once. And I think there's also, Holly, an assumption that that's like a linear track, right? Like that as you are growing, it just continues to like proportionately continue to increase. There's going to be seasons where like that ability, that window of tolerance for you, whether it's with your religious trauma or with your anxiety or with your social anxiety or your ability to interact with the headlines, whatever that is, it may go up and down, right? It may shift and change. You talk all the time, Hall, about like seasonal living. And I think that is true in so many respects. And one of them is like there are different seasons of healing too. There are seasons where we have a lot more time and energy to invest in those things. There's other seasons
Mhm.
where we have to pull back a little bit or something happens that impacts that capacity. And so I think having grace with ourselves is really important to name.
Mhm.
Um, but I think also like normalizing that that's not always a linear tracking progression.
Mm, mm. That's really beautiful. And I think that even there's like a goal conversation to have here. Like it can be so healthy to set goals for ourselves in certain circumstances. In a lot of circumstances, like there is that like movement towards making progress. That's really important. But sometimes we become so focused on the goal that it's actually really harmful for us. And so when we're talking about like anything within like a window of tolerance, if your goal is purely on expansion and you're not focused, like you're focusing on like when this expands, when this can get bigger, when I can have this bigger reach, when I can give more of myself, I think that we can do a huge disservice to the impact we're making in the moment, and we can be in a hurry. Like it can cause us to feel like we need to hurry that along instead
Yeah.
of realizing, like, this is where I'm at now. Like,
Mhm.
I've made peace with where I'm at now. There's not a timeline on when this has to expand, but I
Yeah.
can do so much in this space. Like, I can give this much in this space, and it's beautiful and it's enough. And this like back of your head, like someday this will
Mhm.
grow, but I'm not focused on that. I'm focused on here and now. And I
Mhm.
think that for some of us, it's like there's like a survival mechanism in like wanting to rush to that point because we want there to be, and this is a huge religious trauma trigger that I think a
Mhm.
lot of people experience, but it's like this like my calling or my purpose and finding that one thing, like one day I can live in my purpose to like have this national reach or whatever that is, and then realize like the here and now is so
Yeah.
important. Like we don't want to take away from that we miss out on that
Mhm.
time of to be present with ourselves, with what we need, with what we are at the capacity to give, knowing that like we will grow. Like
Yeah.
that's part of healing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I would also say, like when you said this is a big religious trauma trigger, right? And one of the things that I also think about is how in a lot of faith spaces, um, there is a heavy emphasis on the pretty resolution tied up with a bow. Here's my story to tell, right? And so I think a lot of times, especially in a lot of like Christian culture spaces, it's oh, you need to share your story. You need to share your testimony. And like, there's this belief that, again, you go from the struggle to the mountaintop or the victory, like really quickly, and that there's no struggle in that, you have faith and it just goes away or it just disappears or you get to claim victory, whatever that language is that gets used. Um, and I think, again, equally problematic. And this idea that doesn't, I'm trying to think through how I want to say this. I think what I want to say is that a lot of times really structured, heavy power and control religion doesn't have a lot of tolerance
Mm,
for failure or for
yeah.
progress or
Yeah.
for the actual process of healing, which can be slow and messy.
Hmm.
And in the absence of that tolerance, there's kind of this pushing of like a premature victory and like, oh, let's share that story. And it really ends up putting people into a very vulnerable position, a very triggering position. And so I think it also just reminds us, for those of us that are listening, especially that are faith leaders, and we talk about trying to do trauma informed ministry, like it is not your job as a pastor, as a faith leader, to expand someone's window of tolerance for them as an act of prophecy or faith. That is harmful and that is very neglectful in terms of a leadership capacity and behavior. And so, like, using language like, I have a message for you, or this needs to happen, or I've seen this, like using those kind of things in a manipulative way to try to expand somebody or push somebody outside of a place that they're comfortable, can also be a really oftentimes used power and control technique that we see in organized religion.
Yeah, I think that's so good and so important that you named that. I also think that when you're talking about that religious trauma piece, there are certain barriers that we experience that like kind of define what our tolerance is
Mhm.
that are honestly can be really taboo in like religious circles because they can be seen as like, oh, you don't have enough faith or you're not
Yeah.
good enough. And two of those to me that come to mind are the area of finances. Like I'm limited, especially for people on like a fixed income or being, we're in this season, like being parents and like having families and having this like responsibility to take care of our kiddos and our family. And like, so how limiting finances can be and how that can be really hard to deconstruct that and realize like it's okay if my answer is I can't do this because I can't afford it or I can't
Yeah.
financially do anymore. And the other one is time. And we
Yeah.
are only given so many hours a day. And like we just talked about this on our wintering podcast, like, and there's even less time in the day, even though our Gregorian calendar stays the same and our clock looks the same. There's less daylight and our bodies that respond to the circadian rhythms, they're more tired and they're more weary. And so right now, like our capacity for time may feel even less. And to
Yeah.
give ourselves permission to realize that those barriers are there, they're real to us. Like they
Mhm.
are real, they are important in our life. And it's okay that that has made that window smaller and that you don't have to apologize for that or explain that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think a lot of times people can feel like trying to engage in a faith space requires them to defend their
Hmm.
energy, their time, their resources, their boundaries. And again, it's a lack of respect that I think we often see. And I think that lack of respect also camouflages, right, as the spiritual manipulation, which we could go into a whole lot of conversations around, right? Like the way that volunteers are oftentimes like really taken advantage of in faith spaces and a lot of those kind of things. And so, like, knowing what your capacity is, knowing what your window of commitment is, right? Again, like if we're using that same kind of concept, and being willing to define that for yourself, like that right now in this season, right? Like I'm raising kids and I have a partner and I have a full-time job and I have other activities in the community. Like this is what I can give right now. And kind of recognizing again, like this may be all I can give right now, but I'm going to do my best in that space if that's what you choose to do. And
Yeah.
if it shifts and changes in the future, great. But that's personal and that's you and that's your decision to make and
Mhm.
your level of comfort and choice, not something to be manipulated or changed by someone else.
Yeah. I mean, I think so often our culture is drawn to stories of the one that like rises up and speaks up and like becomes that driving force for change because we have like idolized that character. I
Yeah.
think if we were really honest with ourselves, us as individual people are often even more drawn to the stories of someone who makes a change or does something on this like small level of this is my reach and here's how I change things in that reach. Like here's how I change things at my school or here's
Yeah.
how I as a parent change things for my children. Here's how I change things for my
Yeah.
neighborhood. Like I think that we often celebrate those and feel more drawn to those because they feel more accessible. They feel more relatable to us. And honestly, that's how things change is that they change on these micro levels and it's everybody doing that on the micro levels. But for some reason we still compare ourselves to these like macro stories. And like let's just be real, like if everybody tried to stand up and change things on this like massive macro level, like there would be so much. I mean, you see that now with those that are on those levels. There is so much competition and there's so much conflict and there's so much this and that in comparison. And like, true change starts when it starts small, and there's so much beauty to that, and we just need to be confident enough to own that.
Mm, yeah, yeah. I think as we start to kind of wrap this conversation up, I think it's important to also, Holly, you talked at the beginning kind of like knowing ourselves and that these are personal places, right? Like a window of tolerance is not a cookie cutter template for every single person. And
Yeah.
so, everyone's going to be unique. Everyone's comfort level and what they can handle before they get too activated or before they shut down is going to be really different. And so I think one thing I just want to kind of spend a few minutes talking about is like, how do you start to recognize those things for yourself? Because we do live in a culture that is full of, like you talked about before, Holly, kind of like comparing and trying to replicate or emulate like what society defines as successful or good or, valuable. And so instead of honoring what's good in us, we try to replicate what's good in somebody else or celebrate it in someone else. And so I think it's just important to note, like, in those places, right? Like, if we talk about the high end of your window of tolerance, when you start to kind of push that, right? And you're not respecting that boundary in yourself, um, you're going to really start to operate out of a space that probably feels really scattered and maybe has some trouble solving problems because you feel like your mind's going really fast. You may be really prone to like big emotions in
Yeah.
that space and like a lot of overreactions or disproportional reaction.
Mm.
Um, a lot of like fuzzy thinking, like again, too many thoughts. And it's just hard to concentrate. It's hard to pay attention. I think there's also just as chemicals output, right? At that space, your body's trying to say, whoa, hold on a minute. And as those chemicals start to flood our body, there's also kind of this like heart rate that increases and our breathing that increases. And we may have trouble sleeping in that space. And so, like, just paying attention to when your body's trying to tell you, hold on, like, because when we operate too long outside of that window of tolerance, right? I mean, it has physical health consequences for us. It's not just about, our internal comfort. It's not just about our mental health healing. We are holistic people and all those pieces work together. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, similarly, paying attention to the bottom end too, right? Like when you start numbing out, when you start just getting really apathetic and like maybe emotions and empathy that are kind of normal for you just suddenly are gone, and you're like, I really don't care. I'm not, I'm not super motivated. I'm just kind of numb. I'm just kind of here. And you just feel really checked out. Equally, really important for us to pay attention to.
Yeah. Mm, that's really good. That's really good. Yeah, I hope that there's a lot of I hope that this is providing language for people.
Mhm.
I hope that it's providing some affirmations. Because I think the most motivating thing we can do is give people permission to be self-aware, to figure out who they are, where they're at, so that they're operating within that place of this is who I am. This is what I is my capacity right now. And that's what motivates people, not to aspire to something unachievable, even though it feels really like that would be the ultimate goal or that would be
Right.
let's be realistic. Like the world we live in is a lot. It's
Yeah.
there's so much going on. There's so much we're facing. There's so much in our personal lives we're facing. And
Yeah.
we do ourselves so much, we do so much harm when we dismiss those things that we ourselves are facing.
Yeah.
And we harm others. Like we are so much more likely to cause harm to others, whether it's intentional or not intentional, when we are hyper aroused or hypo aroused. And so when we are triggered, when we are shut down, and when we're operating purely from a place of burnout. And so I hope that there's just like this is offering a sense of some language, and
Yeah.
also just some permission of like I think the most beautiful journey that we can all be on that is a very justice-based conversation. Like this is not just like, hey, tune
Mhm.
out the world and do this. This is very much like so that we can be engaged in justice work is
Yeah.
be doing the work of like self-awareness
Right. You
and
may not be able to fix it all, but
yeah,
like what's the piece where you can still feel like you're leveraging and creating change? Because I think that's empowering for us.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Um, I want to say one final word to faith leaders, in terms of like applying this conversation. And this actually may be a separate conversation that we need to have at some point deeper. But keep in mind, this is really important to me, and it's a super pet peeve of mine from a trauma-informed ministry standpoint. Like, I think there's been a lot of teaching in the last couple of decades in the name of like pastoral efficiency, of trying to kind of like streamline pastoral care and create like systems to check on people. And I've heard systems of like so many different like contacts and, different things. It's really, really, really important to recognize this concept and apply it into your ministry in a way that says somebody's window of tolerance may be that like they can't engage, period.
Mm,
Like their window of tolerance right now is maxed out just like reading a newsletter, right? And that just may be way too much for them right now. And so like meeting people where they are, um, for me, a lot of times when I connect with somebody new who may say, like, oh, I've been following and paying attention to your services and I watch online. I just can't bring myself to come back into
mm,
a church building. Like, I'm going to respect that window of tolerance all day long, but I still want to try to build relationship and connection to give them some degree of support. And so, right, I may say, I would love to have coffee and just maybe have a chance to get to know you and get to know your story. Or, do a Zoom call or whatever that looks like. And meeting people where they are and respecting their window of tolerance is giving people the autonomy to have their own healing journey at the pace and the rate and the places that are the safest for them. And I think that's really important, that that should never, ever, ever come with guilt and shame.
yeah, yeah,
So,
I love that.
yeah.
So, as we're wrapping this conversation up, do you have any like final resources or words or anything you want to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we will put some resources to kind of explore this concept a little bit more if it's new to you, in the show notes of our podcast this week. So you can always check there for more things.
Mhm.
And I do think that we'll be creating some resources at the Faith and Trauma Center in our resource libraries to kind of use some of this and give you some imagery for that. Those may come a little bit later. And I do think that
We
there's
have the
some other
capacity.
pieces. Do I?
Because we have capacity to.
Right, we have some capacity right now. So, but yeah, I think this is language that you'll hear more frequently as we talk through things, and so it's just kind of an introduction to that concept.
Yeah. I love that. Well, thank you for having this conversation with me. I always enjoy our tea and coffee chats.
Yeah, we're both drinking tea today, so
That is cool.
I know.
And I think it's cool that you all are engaging with us. So thank you. And we will be back hopefully next week. I think we've been a really great example lately of just like things have been going on. Life is crazy. Like, so we don't always have a podcast every single week, and that's okay. And I think we've given ourselves a lot of permission to be like, don't force it. It'll happen when it's meant to happen. And it's just kind of like we get to surprise you all with when we get to drop a new episode. And I actually secretly love that. So for those of you that are frustrated by that, I'm sorry, but here's some room for growth. So we will be back hopefully next week with another conversation. And see you back here soon.
All right, sounds great. Bye, everybody.